The ECHO Network is a social innovation partnership steered by the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. It's inspired by nature's communication, and it's an effort to create a new generation of scientists who can really work across sectors and across disciplines, and that they can unite together with citizens and industry and government and academia and NGOs to tackle real-world problems through interdisciplinary communication and scientific research. So in order to do this, we have to first understand what are the current issues that India is facing for its human and environmental ecosystems, and identify specific ways that science and technology can play a role in solving these problems. Given the current crisis, what we decided to do is that our first effort would be to take stock of the current situation and propose recommendations for how science and technology can take us towards a bright future. So to this end, we worked with a number of professionals, healthcare professionals, economists, lawyers, scholars, policymakers, activists, journalists, and CEOs to share with us and with each other their ideas. So through a series of discussion, together we worked on a white paper called India's Journey Beyond COVID-19. And you can find that on our website, www.econetwork.in. So this paper was intended to start conversations amongst all different kinds of communities and with broader communities at large on how science and technology can help bring India forward. And so we're starting these conversations with you today. That's the purpose of this session. So we hope that the conversation that you hear today and the subsequent conversations we'll have over the next month will generate more conversations among your communities on how to bring science and society closer together. So please do reach out to us on our social media, on email, anywhere to let us know how we can participate with you further. For the past week, we've been listening to the questions that you've been raising, particularly for our current experts, but also for our experts going forward, and we're going to start discussing them with Priya and Usha today. There will be time at the end of this session for you to take a few questions using the Q&A button that you have on your screen right now. So you can raise questions there as well. However, we're not likely to get through everybody's question at this time. So what we ask you to do is please follow along on those Q&As and see if there's already a question there that you find very important or relevant or interesting, and please like it. And those upvoted questions, the most upvoted questions, will be the ones we'll probably try to tackle first. So with that in mind, we can start, and I'd like to start by introducing today's experts. I have had the great privilege of working with these two really wonderful people over the past few weeks, getting to know them a little bit better, and our network is very much looking forward to continuing to work with them as we grow. Dr. Priya Shyamsundar is the lead economist at the Nature Conservancy. She leads a global science team that undertakes research on the economics of conservation, including benefits of environmental interventions and designing economic policy and behavioral nudges that encourage action. Her research covers a range of conservation and global climate change issues, and she has a particular focus on economic development. She is a member of IUFRO's expert panel on forests and poverty. She is currently involved in the IPCC global assessment of forest and poverty, and she has served on advisory panels for the Government of India, the World Bank, the IGPP, and she's a board member of the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. So Priya, thank you so much for joining us today and for being part of this effort. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, glad to be here.
The next expert that we're going to introduce today is Dr. Usha Ramanathan. She works on jurisprudence of law. She works on poverty and rights. She's a researcher, a writer, a speaker on issues, everything from the nature of law, like the global gas disaster, mass displacement, scavenging, civil liberties, including the death penalty, beggary, and other issues of our civil liberties and other things we're tackling in India. She has been engaging with the UID project, and she's written and debated extensively on issues of technology and human conditions of freedom and liberty over the years. She's also been part of several government committees, like the committee set up by the Prime Minister in 2013 to study socioeconomic status of tribal communities, and that was released as a report in 2014. And among other things, she's been awarded the Access Now's Human Rights Heroes Award in 2019. So thank you, Usha, very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. So to begin this conversation, actually, I'd like to hear from both of you a little bit about, why you're here today. What is your motivation to be part of this effort, and what brought you to be part of something like we're trying to do here today and going forward? So maybe Priya, can you start?
Thank you, Shannon. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion. So this COVID pandemic is the single largest health and economic shock that has hit the world, at least in my lifetime. What do we have now? Something like 13 million cases globally, over 600,000 deaths, potential reduction in global GDP by 5 to 8%. But saying all of this does not really address sort of the untold misery and the uncertainty that this has brought to specific peoples, specific populations, communities that have been directly hit either by the health impact or by the economic shock. So if this doesn't motivate all of us, I don't know what else would motivate anybody to think deeply about how we together as a global community can try to address and prevent the occurrence of such shocks in the future. The other issue, of course, is that this is a zoonotic disease, at least we think it is. 70% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. And they are caused by land use disturbances. And those of us who worry about conservation, worry about biodiversity, have been thinking about this for a long time. And we know that there are costs associated with rampant land use, unmanaged changes, and that we need to address them. And this is related, related to the kind of to a little bit of the lack of attention that we pay to these changes, the fact that we don't provide them the kind of significance that we should be. So conservation strategies, I think, can influence how we deal with land use changes, and which can influence how these emerging infectious diseases hurt our communities in the future. So that's another reason for me to worry about this.
Thank you very much, Priya, and it will be good to talk with you a little bit more in detail about some of those issues that you raised as we go forward. So, Usha, how about you?
Yeah, it hit all of us. It was a complete shock when it happened. Like Priya says, I don't think any of us anticipated that in our lifetimes we'll see the world just stop. So it's not just what was happening, it's also what completely stopped happening. And it's initially I thought of it as a pause, like somebody hit the pause button on the world and then it'll start again, but we have to be careful not to allow it to go back to the old normal, because there is something plainly wrong with it. It's something that's been debated, agitated over, fought over the day, especially the last, the 70, 80 decades that are just passed. But going back to a little before, maybe from Industrial Revolution, from oil, and then now what we see, what we've seen happening around us. But from a pause, it's become a long pause. And the consequences of that are really huge. See, mine is just one mind, and it's constantly, like everybody else is worrying about how to think about these things. So when you said that there is this chance to speak with each other, and then maybe create knowledge out of that, or at least an understanding out of that, it was really, really tempting. And it's also become very important that, we have a Tamil film with a very popular song in it, where at one point this God who comes to the earth to teach an arrogant man a lesson, just says that, when I say stop, the world will stop. And everything stops. I mean, the coconut trees stop, waving, the fronds are all still, the waves stop exactly where they are. When it starts again in the song, it just continues. And my thing was that we shouldn't let that happen. It's important that we recognize what's happening and roll back. If we've got to roll the waves back, then we need to do it. And the only way we can do it is if we pool all our intelligences together. In a sense, this has produced an opportunity for both experience and imagination, and it shouldn't be lost.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you said, there's so many things that have been raised in our mind right now that they just keep spinning around. How could this happen? How are we going to deal with it? And honestly, one of those that is on everybody's mind is the migrant worker crisis, which was such a huge symbol of a lot of the struggles that we're facing in India. And you've been working a lot with this. So I'd like to start with a question for you, Usha, on this. And it was raised by Gadi Gangappa from UAS in Bangalore. And he said, what steps can we take to provide migrant workers with confidence and security to prevent mass migrations in the future? So I'd like to hear what you think about this.
This, what this COVID period has taught us about people is so significant. See, the thing is that migrant workers have forever been treated like they are a burden on the system, not like contributors to the system, which is perhaps why when lockdowns happened, when various kinds of measures were taken, the migrant workers were not taken into the reckoning at all. The fact that we had millions of people who are not in their homes, who are not in any kind of safe space, and who you can't lock down because they are not in a space that can be locked. It just, it's amazing how the way in which our system over the decades has treated workers and migrant workers even more starkly as people who are irrelevant, but who are there and therefore get used. I think this time it's told us, especially, after they started going back, and then the desperation of industry and of various, not just industry, but of various kinds of activities, hungering for the migrant workers to come back. I think the least that it should have done would have been to produce a respect for the kind of work that they have, and therefore a respect for the person. If it can't be done from having respect for the person to respect for their work, at least the other way around. Unfortunately, that's not what we are seeing. We are seeing a dilution of labor laws. We are seeing this period being taken as an opportunity where many things that industry has been asking for instance, hire and fire policies, self-certification, being able to control without having to give any social security or protection to workers. All of this coming in, and in addition, from 8 hours to 12 hours, expanding working time every day, making overtime work not payable like overtime, but be paying it like, it's like the working classes are there just there for their labor. They are not there for anything else. So long as this is the attitude, I don't think that we are going to find any major change where workers will come because they are coming to a hospitable space. And that's going to be one of our major problems. I think also we need to make a distinction between movement and migration. And we find that there are governments who are now saying that if anybody wants to move, if anyone wants to take migrant workers to work, you have to go through the government. Actually, it's a very strange thing because since 1979, we've had the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act. That act came in because migrant workers get exploited. And that act has never been activated. It required the state, it required principal employers, it required contractors to take responsibility for maintaining records so that people do not get exploited. And that has remained a dead letter, largely. And that's because we never really cared about them. Now they're saying that we will put a curb on the movement of people who might go as labor. instead of providing those protections which might actually help them move and work and live and grow without being exploited. I think we need to visit this idea of exploitation, of movement, of migration, of work really deeply if we want to make that change.
So Priya, Usha just brought up the issue of respect, and that we have to bring respect and increase that respectability in these migrant workers. So one of that is by ensuring their livelihoods. So what kind of jobs are you visualizing that could be created for these migrant workers? This actually was a question created by Madhu Verma, who's a chief economist at the World Resources Institute.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Usha, who speaks deeply and passionately about the set of conditions that make life really difficult for migrant workers. I think we really have to pause. I mean, this pause that we've had, I hope it, for many people in India and elsewhere in the world, frankly, I hope it really gives them and gives us time to reflect on these invisible communities. People who do a lot of work, but who we don't know anything about, who we don't ask questions about. Who are they? Where do they come from? Why are they here? What made them move from Assam to Kerala? How did they get here? Who did they leave behind? What are their stories? Do they have children who are fatherless or motherless? And, what do we pay them? Is that really enough? Do they send them back? Send the money back? How do they send the money back? Is it safe for them to send the money back? Do they sell their wares to us? How do they bring those wares to us? I really, really think it's so important for us who are dependent on migrant labor in one form or the other, to really take a breath and think about the lives of these people who help us, but who are invisible to the system. Yeah, so I think that pause and continuously thinking about their stories is really an important part of how we try to design a better life for all of us together. So I want to say that. There are obviously short-term and long-term measures. We are in crisis, and people are in crisis, so we can't create new systems when we are in crisis. And so we need to rely on existing programs for employment generation. The Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, there's lots written about it, there's lots said about it, there's lots of questions asked about it. But right now in crisis, you have to rely on systems that pre-exist the crisis, that can be used to support people who are in crisis. So we have to use those kinds of systems to create employment and increase opportunities, particularly in districts that have seen, a large increase in return migrants. So that is really, so kind of focusing on that. There's been a lot of effort in trying to use schemes such the Narega to help with degraded watersheds and spring sheds. And this may be an opportunity to really be doing a lot more of that, because relatively speaking, given the vast investments of that sort of scheme, there's less invested in these common lands. And here might be an opportunity to create employment for people who have returned and do longer term restoration, because we know that land in India is very degraded and common lands are degraded. So there are possibilities to use the short-term crisis to reinvigorate spring sheds, watersheds, land areas that might that could be restored, right? So that's one option. We also know that 90% of the jobs in India are in the informal sector. So anything we can do to clear the path for MSMEs, micro and small and medium enterprises, anything we can do to bolster this part of this set of institutions and enterprises in the economy. And I know there's a lot of discussion. There are lots of people who are thinking about it. I know this will be part of the next set of discussions that ECHO organizes. But really, I mean, you know, we need to also be thinking very carefully about the informal sector and where there is sort of this overlap between the informal sector and migrant communities, because 90% of the jobs in this country are in the informal sector. In the longer term, I think we need to think of strategies that provide jobs in a distributed fashion, you know, so that there are jobs. There will always be migrants. There is no question about it. And so the kinds of issues that Usha talks about that can give power to these migrants so that they are able to exercise a little bit of power to make their lives a little bit better, right? Those legal and institutional reforms are incredibly important. But there will always be movement. And so we need to be thinking about both sort of distributed jobs and strengthening jobs wherever they occur for migrants. So where there are opportunities for climate smart pathways, I think here an incredibly important role for science and technology. Like Usha said, let's use this pause to imagine a better future, which is climate smart, because we do not want to be hit again with another climate shock, right? I mean, we want to be able to use this to think about all the different types of shocks that might occur, and they will occur in the future. So can we think about distributed energy systems and such, again, something that will be discussed much more, or regenerative agriculture so that we have more nature positive agriculture? What kinds of jobs should we be thinking about? And how can we use science and technology to rejuvenate agriculture so it's nature positive and just doesn't drain soils and groundwater as it is right now? What kind of institutions can we create that help us manage these systems better and create jobs and livelihoods? I think there is a lot of scope. We don't have all the answers, but I really think we should be thinking about the questions and the answers at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these new jobs, as you mentioned, distributed energy, climate smart, they also require new skill sets, right? Which people might not necessarily have right now. So I mean, education and skilling is also a really big issue. And this was also brought up by a couple of people, Pavan Kumar Gamangati at UAS and also Amarendra Dash at ASMAX. They both brought up about prioritizing health and education and skill development for our communities. But Usha, I mean, this also involves a lot of dealing with socioeconomic inequities, right? Including limited access. So, and that's something I know that you focused on a lot. So in order to get to this sort of bright future that we're talking about, climate smart, we also have to build up the skill sets and education of these communities. Can you talk a bit about that? How we can do that?
Yeah, I think all of us can see that one of the things that's really been, you know, the gap that has shown up hugely is in the context of health. Actually, what is also worrying is that the moment you have a pandemic of this kind, all other issues of health that have been endemic for us over a period of time, they are getting forgotten, and it's causing its own set of problems. This idea of balancing this doesn't, we don't seem to have learned how to deal with this at all, and it's causing its own set of problems. But when you do studies in law and poverty, there are a couple of concepts that come up, and one of those concepts is this one called impoverishment. Because we have, for the longest time as lawyers especially, we've often thought of laws that are related to the poor, like the poor is some kind of, status position in which all of them are. But actually that's not true. People slip into poverty, and a lot of people strive really hard to get out of it. The kinds of things that they definitely need within that, one of those is education. In fact, I've been reading a number of studies of late where every community that is a vulnerable community is working at sending their children to school because they see that as the way out of where they are. I want to make a clear distinction here between skilling and an education. You know, at this time, never mind what skills you had, it wouldn't have helped unless you had the capacity to have, you know, if you didn't have a liberal education where you can see the world and understand the world around you. Otherwise, you just become a subject of that process, whatever it is. Subject of the state, subject of the kind of health crisis that has come in. So when we say education, I think we should be clear that we are talking about people getting equipped to take the world on themselves and not just to become labor for somebody else. So a skill set is something that can come along with an education, but I think it's really important. You know, in this process of impoverishment is a process. So you start off somewhere, like what this period has done is already, you know, persons already in various states of poverty have got further impoverished. And the kind of institutional structures that they need to make sure that they can pull themselves up and help themselves and exercise autonomy are things that are connected with health and with education and with work and with the kind of resources that they themselves have. So when schools, for instance, are unable to deal with taking children on. Now, if you're going to lose a year, I think we need to acknowledge what this kind of loss of education means for people who are first generation learners. You know, I often think of the time when we used to keep reading about what happened with Japan after the Second World War, where the focus, all of the focus of the first few years was to pull all the children in and give them a full education. Learning to read, write, do your arithmetic, and to read about the world becomes a very important and basic part of how we are going to recover from this. So without going too far into our status of education and health earlier, I think we need to acknowledge now at least that the mistakes we've made, we can't afford to continue. And that's why I keep saying this is a useful pause, that we don't go along a road just because we've been traveling down that road. It was a wrong road to take. And acknowledge what people in various conditions of poverty, of vulnerability, of choicelessness have, you know, how they've had to live. I think it's fascinating that you're asking this question at a time when government school children have actually done very well in their CBSE exams, telling us that if you give people an opportunity, they work for the rest. It's that provision that becomes important. And this crossing this period, it's going to be important for us to see how, for instance, health, I think everybody acknowledges now that you can't have just private healthcare. You can't have healthcare that is just going to, that will only be through insurance. You actually need physical facilities in different places. You need access. You need to acknowledge caste. You need to, because caste is another context of access. We need to acknowledge these, and as states need to be able to contend with all of this. That's the first step and most important step in recognizing the socio-economic inequities that exist and the route out of them.
So you've been talking about, education and our children, and of course, children, women and children are an incredibly essential aspect of our society, and often one that's very marginalized. And this is actually a question that was raised by Nazreen Khan from eNewsroom. So Priya, I'd like to ask you, how can we involve women and children in this roadmap that we're discussing, where we're looking towards a future, climate smart education, recognizing people, giving them respect. How can we involve women and children here?
Of course. First, though, let's acknowledge the incredibly important role women are currently playing in managing this crisis, right? Essential public health workers. What is it, 1 million women? These ASHAs, the accredited social health activists who are at the forefront of the government of India's COVID response. How can we equip these public health workers with better training, with better equipment, and strategies, because they do all this work and go back home, and some of them apparently have to bear the stigma that them when they get back home, so they don't have safe homes necessarily or safe communities to go back to because of the work that they do and the exposure that they get. So one sort of set of skills that we really need to make sure people have, including women, are not just the hard skills, but also the soft skills that enable them to do their jobs better and navigate these complex social problems that exist. All our training and our work is within the context, exactly as Usha said, of certain set of societal barriers and considerations. So we need to be sort of, using social science really to be thinking through how do you strengthen these workers to navigate these complex societal issues and still do their jobs well, right? So it's skills in the hard skills of nursing and providing and gathering information and managing these other considerations. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the role of these public health workers who are women who are doing all this work right now. But going forward, there is just an incredibly important role for science and technology. And I think, all sciences, and I mean, definitely to include the social sciences here, in developing solutions. Again, as Usha says, we have to reimagine a better world. And this better world certainly has a better system of agriculture that contributes to jobs and livelihoods, but doesn't mine natural resources as it currently does. Large numbers of blocks, say in Punjab and Haryana, are in critical condition in terms of groundwater. So we think about the current period, we don't think about the future, but the future comes, whether we think about it or not, and it comes and hits us in terms of as shocks, which we have to worry about. So how can we use science and technology and the social sciences to create and imagine better institutions of governance to manage all these diverse current and future interests better, so we can create a healthier system for both jobs and for earth systems, so that earth systems stay rejuvenated. I think there's a role here that we need to be thinking about. We also need to be thinking about renewable energy and distributed energy systems, and there's a role for science and technology. In all of this is going to take both education, which Usha very eloquently made the case for, a liberal education that allows people to manage their lives better, and skills, very specific skills. And here, I think we do want a lens to make sure that young people, and particularly young women, get the kind of training in these new jobs as they emerge. Women's labor force participation, and as labor force participation is measured, not in terms of all the work that they do, but in terms of how it's measured, has actually been on the decline. This was really surprising to me in India, that over the last 2 decades, labor force participation of women has been on the decline. Who would have thought that? I thought we were making a lot of different types of progress. And so we apparently need to put this lens on and make sure that as these new technologies evolve to address these big complex problems that we face, are young women getting trained? Are these jobs in technology enabling girls to participate in the workforce, right? Are we sure? And if not, what? It's not just barriers at home. Are there ways in which we can attract them into these spheres so it becomes attractive for them and their families to get girls educated in these new areas, and for women to take leadership roles, but also to find jobs as these new areas evolve. So I think there's opportunities, but I do think we have to have a lens on this because there are barriers that might stop women from participating in these new opportunities as they evolve. So let's keep that lens on.
Usha, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, if I can just go back for a moment to this idea of impoverishment, because for those who've not followed the debate on impoverishment, it might seem like an abstract notion. I was just trying to list out at least some of the places where we see this, these versions of poverty and impoverishment. Just in law, you have the Contract Labor Act, which these are all about, under our constitution, we call it rights against exploitation. They come within that category. So you have contract labor, you have interstate migrant workmen, you have child labor, you have anti-beggary laws, you have construction workers and laws connected with them, you have manual scavenging, you have the idea of illegality of housing, where people can't be legal. Even if you want to be legal, they can't be legal. You have issues of homelessness, and you have the idea of custodial institutions, which, as we have seen, have been, they've been shockingly bad. And I think among the people who's with us today is Tariq, who's done an enormous amount of work on that. Now, we know that these are already, we have openly, bonded labor, we've openly acknowledged that these are all vulnerable, made vulnerable by the system. It is not the individual who's just vulnerable. It's induced vulnerability. So I believe that any step we take after this has to acknowledge that, so that that vulnerability and that exploitation gets set out of the system. It worries me when I think that people are still talking growth and GDP and still not talking inequity, inequality, and the kind of oppressive practices we have in the system, not just with individuals. And it's that systemic change that I'm hoping we can push now. Now that the pause is getting long, we have more time to really work at it.
So, Usha, I want to stay with you for a second, and I want to switch gears a little bit, because one of the things that we often talk about is we're saying science and technology the whole entire time, but technology itself raises a lot of anxieties, particularly concerning this pandemic. And I know this is something that you're very, very interested and focused on. So I just would like to hear, how can we move forward, and particularly for a program like ECHO, which is very tuned into science and technology and involving in society. So how do we do this in a way where we embrace it in society and not force it upon people? And how do we do this regarding this pandemic?
If I could just say this to begin with, it's I'm going to have scientists and technologists pounce on me for this, but I think some of these phrases that come with the conjunction and, they don't work for me. Science for me is the production of knowledge. It's about knowledge. Technology is about the production of tools.
Yes.
They're not the same thing at all.
No, they are not.
So if we acknowledge that there's a difference, then we shouldn't be thinking of science and technology like they can only exist if, each can exist if the other is holding hands and walking along. It's not true. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that technology is about the production of tools, and tools are subservient to the need of the of whatever. It may be of the human being, it might be of any other being. That's what constitutes tools. So if we learn to think like that and not think of it as something that, technology in the beginning of this century was just exciting. I don't think anybody had problems with it. Everybody picked up everything that they could get and were using it. The anxieties have come because just like the internet got privatized, you're finding that there are huge, big companies, monopolies who want all our data, who sell us the idea that they can tell us when we'll fall ill, and they'll tell us in advance, and they'll come, and it's like a new god and a new religion. And India is a country which receives gods and religions very happily. So we have to be cautious about what we do with this. For instance, I think it's in a time like now to use the internet to be able to take classes, for instance. is not altogether a bad thing because it's better than nothing. But to say that this is how we need to therefore standardize ourselves because this is the great way to be, this is a technologist's dream. This is not an education's dream, nor is it a parent's dream. I mean, in Punjab, you keep hearing about parents having to, who can hardly buy food, having to buy a mobile phone, a smartphone for a child, because the child can't attend classes otherwise. And the child is so keen on education, which kind of links it up with what we were saying before. So these hard choices should not be something that they have to make. And I was hearing about, villages, from what I heard, it was in Kerala, where you have, in our young years, it used to be that at 8:45 news and 9 o'clock news in the village would be, there's a little panchayat ghar at that time. And from there, you'll have a radio there and there'll be a megaphone that will speak to everybody. So everyone hears the same news and then they'll sit, we call it tinne, and they'll sit there and they'll have their conversations. So this democratizing of education is a very different thing from saying we are going to democratize by giving everyone equipment and tools. So it's about how, it's about recognizing that technology is a good servant and a bad master. Once we see that, I think our policies will fall much better in place. And this idea that, now that we have COVID, everyone should get, all over the world should get, not just get vaccinated, but should have digital certificates without which they can't leave their houses. As it is, COVID has taught us that liberty can get so easily curtailed. Now, when persons in technology come in and tell us that, no, we tell you that the only way that you can move around this, if you can show your digital certificate, there's something really the matter there, because there are no protections. Most countries don't have, data protection laws. Even if you had data protection laws, regulation will be difficult. And there is a deep urge. It's like a, primeval urge that technology controllers seem to have to gather all data about everybody. This mopping up and this opportunistic mopping up is, I must confess, quite vulgar. And when that vulgarity eases, I think our anxieties about technology will also come down. Just one other thing, that we have had a number of technologies in our midst for a while. When certain technologies do not work or they fail, there has to be an acknowledgement. If they continue anyway saying that it's okay, 60% we make our profits, we carry on, it's not going to produce any trust. There is a severe trust deficit in this. They're talking about one nation for across the country. The whole thing is based on fingerprint biometric. Fingerprint biometric is not working for persons who are manual workers, for people who are old, for people who are young, for people who are a whole range of things, old people who can't go to the shops. So now they've kind of sidily acknowledged that and said, okay, we will allow you to nominate someone to lend their fingerprint for you. It's an admission, it's such a circuitous admission or acknowledgement that fingerprints have failed, but you refuse to make a direct acknowledgement and change the system. You're putting the burden on people. How do you expect that trust will increase if you treat people in this kind of way? Surveillance systems, every day you have a new surveillance system, and it's tech companies that are working with them. Edward Snowden told us how at the NSA, all the major tech companies were sitting there and giving them all the world's data. This is not going to produce trust. There is a definite breakdown of trust and an increased anxiety about technology and its uses, about who controls it and what will happen to us. This has to be dealt with before you really talk about using it as a tool.
Very good. Yeah, and that's actually a question that was raised by our Shubham in the Q&A about how, when millions of people don't have an internet connection, how do we deal with the future of education, and then also lots of other things, banking, everything is done online now, right? So thank you for addressing that. Priya, I think before we go to the other Q&A questions, I'd just like to ask you another question. It's a very interesting one brought up by Nishant Kumar at the Wildlife Institute of India and at Oxford. So he asked about multiplicity of space, and that this is the biggest question of the century. And I wasn't able to touch base with him. So in my interpretation of this question, I understand to be, just that we're all fighting for space, space for everything, for people, for animals, for plants, for our ecosystems, for our biodiversity, for our buildings, for our natural resources. Everything takes up space and it's limited, right? So, and how we can incorporate science and technology into addressing this issue, which is going to continue to be an issue in India for several decades, because unlike a lot of other countries, our rate of population growth is not going to be dropping very much.
Right, right. So Shannon, as you yourself have pointed out to me, India has 20% of the world's population and 17% of the world's biodiversity hotspots. So to think that we can move forward in this world without addressing trade-offs is sort of, pie in the sky. I think there are trade-offs, essential trade-offs that we will constantly be confronting. And the big question is, how do we address these trade-offs? And is there a role for, and there is most certainly a role for science and technology in balancing these needs? Trade-offs between people and nature, and trade-offs between different people and nature, right? So thinking of these differences amongst people, incredibly important. Again, to go back to what Usha said, poverty is a very dynamic issue. There are people who are poor, who are not poor, and who are transitorily poor, people moving up and down that poverty line. And many of these people, particularly in rural areas, are incredibly closely tied to how resources are used and dependent on this. So anyway, how can we be thinking about science and technology? I mean, this is such a big question. Clearly, whatever I say will be a small part of it. But in my mind, there's sort of three sets of issues that we should be thinking about and constantly thinking about the role of science and technology. Again, including social sciences, political science, institutions, governance, all of that, right? So we have to absolutely be thinking about improvements in the efficiency in the use of space, agricultural yields. We should be thinking about how to use climate smart, nature positive agriculture so we can improve these yields so farmers get a reasonable return for the effort that they put in. So and here science and technology, they can be problematic, and with or without, science provides options, technology then takes this and provides specific strategies, but and they're not without problems, as the Green Revolution has taught us. But there is no future without trying to use science and technology to address these problems, to become more efficient in how we use our lands and our waters without polluting them. So that's a big part of it. I think the second, or perhaps the most important part of it is improvements in governance and institutions. Our social institutions, our legal institutions that provide some safeguards to people who are struggling at the bottom, but also enable growth in science and technology. So we are not restricted, right? I mean, we want to balance this between allowing the entrepreneurial spirit to grow so we don't get stymied, and provide the essential safeguards. But without, let's take these institutions very seriously. I mean, there is nothing we can do if we don't get smart about our institutions too. It's not like we can just create these high-yielding plants in test tubes and get them out without the right institutions in place, so that we don't have these external effects, negative effects on our rivers and our groundwater and the things like that. So I think some deep, sort of a whole system of thinking, new thinking about governance and institutions, and tying it to science and technology is very important. And then the third area, which I think science and technology does well, is monitoring and evaluation. I really, I think we should be thinking about ways to do this that are not divisive, which they have become. But for example, with these emerging infectious diseases, we have to have disease surveillance, right? We have to be thinking about how do you create these One Health policies with some manner of surveillance for these new diseases, and thinking of strategies to monitor changes. I have some colleagues who do some really, really cool work, and I don't want this to be just about doom and gloom. I want to be thinking about the really good things that also happen. They listen to birds, they listen to the forest, just as you do. You can listen and record how nature speaks, and then identify what is happening to biodiversity as a result of land use change through these ecoacoustic technologies. I mean, isn't that really cool that you don't have to go and count every species and all of that, but you can listen? And that's I think that's a really essential part of whatever we do. Now, how do we create the institutions to ensure that this type of technology that enables us to listen doesn't hurt people? And that's a governance issue that we have to take very seriously. But both there's a balance there. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I answered it. I would have only partially answered it because it's such a huge question.
Yeah, but I think he added some clarification in the talk, and you can maybe check it out. I do want to, because we only have a few minutes left, I want to get to a couple of the other questions that were brought up during the session today. So Dishant clarified a little bit about human waste in animals and that multiplicity of spaces. So which you did touch upon during your answer, I think. So and I think it's a big issue. So I think we can have a whole session just on that topic. One of the interesting questions that was brought up by Rajaswari is about why this kind of interdisciplinary thinking and research hasn't happened in India until now, and how much of India's S&T works on sustainable livelihoods and secure human environmental ecosystems, and why haven't we done more? I don't know if I can answer that question either. I mean, that's why the ECHO network exists. So, but I mean, do either of you have any insights on that question?
Look, go ahead, Usha. I have some thoughts, but yeah.
Yeah, I can wait too.
No, I think there are systemic issues why interdisciplinary research is less rewarded than disciplinary research. Sort of in our education systems, in our educational institutions, there are silos that are very hard to cross because the entire publication system, the kind of funding system, the set of rewards and incentives that people have enables us to remain in our silos. I think that is slowly shifting, and I think this understanding that we have to understand human systems along with sort of science, ways in which science and technology can help to optimize our responses is beginning to emerge, and your network is a part of this, and I'm seeing this elsewhere. I personally can no longer do social science without really thinking through or working in partnership with other environmental scientists and people from other disciplines. I think that's where the real opportunities are for not incremental growth, but for the kinds of leaps that we want to make. Right? We can keep making these small little changes in our own silos, but if you want to make these big leaps, I think we really need to be bringing these disciplines together. So I applaud you for doing that.
Usha, do you have anything to add there?
I was actually thinking, this is my reading. I mean, I'm not saying it from any kind of empirical study or anything, but from observation. I'm not quite sure that we don't have the kind of, walkways where we are talking to each other. I mean, I think it is happening, and it's happened much more in the past 20, 25 years than, say, it happened I think somewhere around the 80s it did begin. So the silos got broken. and people interested in what was happening in an area, in a certain kind of, for instance, displacement. The displacement debate has had a large number of people from, from environmentalists to economists to scientists, to technologists to, to lawyers to whoever else. I remember that when the Uttarkashi earthquake happened, there was a bus that went from Delhi to Uttarkashi and came back. And in it were people representing a variety of disciplines. And usually it would be the lawyer who will come in last to say, okay, I'll take you to court. But that time they even included the lawyer. So I actually got first-hand view of how these conversations happen. So I'm not sure that our problem is that we don't talk to each other and that we haven't broken some of those walls. But I do think that we need to deepen our engagement. Generally, even those of us who work in our own fields, the depth of understanding and the depth of knowledge that we need to see, maybe we are not doing that enough. It's a judgment that I'm making not on just the community, I'm making it on myself too. So I don't feel hesitant to say it, but it is important for us to be able, for instance, when I see the discussion that's going on migrant labor now, I find that there is a lot of concern, there's compassion, there are a range of other things, but there isn't really the kind of understanding that we should have been able to develop over these 30 years. And it doesn't make sense to me. So maybe it is not about talking to each other, but it's just about getting deeper so that what we are talking to each other has greater impact. It's a burden we have to put on ourselves, and I don't think we've done that enough.
Yeah, and learning how to listen.
We have to drop the halo complex and say, my being concerned makes me a saintly person. No, it doesn't. Do your work. So it's for all of us.
Very good. Thank you both. I think on that note, we are at our hour time. I could sit here and talk to you for another 2 hours. I think I would wear you out, but I have very, very much enjoyed this. And I hope that all of our participants have enjoyed it. I see you still have some questions. We are going to ask for your feedback and your continued inputs as we move forward. The network's just getting started, so we need your inputs and your ideas. Please attend our next session on livelihoods that will be happening next week on the 23rd. And we will continue to have sessions every week until August 6th. So I hope you will continue to join us. Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Usha. It was awesome, as always, to talk to both of you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone. So stay safe and stay hopeful. Bye.